Hello, it's my pleasure to introduce Nicholas Weindling, Manager of JPMorgan Japanese, an investment trust listed on the London Stock Exchange. So Nicholas, thank you for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
So let's start out by looking at why you think Japan is so interesting from an investment perspective.
Right, I think there's really 3 points that come to mind when we're thinking about why invest in Japan. The first is this is an incredibly rich and vibrant market. There are over 4,000 listed companies here. There are many new companies coming to the market each year. So it's a very dynamic place. The second thing is that investing in Japan is not really, I think, like many people expect it to be. And that throws up an awful lot of opportunity. To put it in really simple terms, I think a lot of people think Japan is very technologically advanced and way ahead of the rest of the world, whereas actually in many areas, Japan is lagging, and it's a great place in which to invest. And the third thing I'd highlight is that there is a real sea change going on here in attitudes towards corporate governance. That's been happening for a few years, but we still think that it's at a very early stage. And this is the single most important thing to understand when thinking about, what kind of valuations might investors ascribe to Japanese companies, say in 3 or 5 years' time.
So what's the outlook for Japan's economy over the next year? And in your sort of opinion, what industries will drive that growth?
Well, here at JP Morgan, we tend to think about things in a longer term view, maybe like 5 or 10 years. But when we look at about just the next 1 year, I think the first thing to say is that the Japanese economy and the Japanese stock market are quite different things. The stock market here is a very relatively highly cyclical market. So there's many companies which are sensitive to the global economy, and there's a lot of exporting companies. So that's a very important consideration, especially if we think about at the moment. Hopefully the vaccine will mean the global economy continues to recover, and then Japan will be a prime beneficiary of that. One thing to be aware of in Japan is that although we've had a relatively good experience of the coronavirus so far, in the extent that anybody can have a good experience, the rollout of the vaccine here is relatively slow. So that could mean that the domestic economy could be a little bit slower to recover. But as I said, for the stock market overall, it's really the global economy that is the key driver.
Okay, so Japan's Prime Minister Yoshihide Suga, relatively new in his role. So what changes do you think he'll make to how the country is run, and how would that affect your investment portfolio?
He is relatively new, but I think when it comes to Japanese politics, the key thing to look at is the ruling party, which is the Liberal Democratic Party, who've basically been in power almost uninterrupted now for many, many years, decades, in fact. And we think it's very unlikely that the Liberal Democratic Party won't be in control over the next few years. Suga himself, I think there's really 2 distinguishing policies he has. One is that he wants to make a push towards digitalization in Japan. Japan is very, very far behind the rest of the world. In fact, when we've had things like coronavirus test results in this country, they are faxed to the local government, who then get all the faxes together and come up with the final daily total of cases. So really stuck something you'd say 20 or 30 years ago. And we only just start to see things like electronic signatures being embraced or cashless payments. So he's really making a big push there. And he's going to have a ministry responsible for this digitalization push. And the second thing that really marks him out is a commitment he made at the end of last year to make Japan carbon neutral by 2050. And Japan is at a very early stage in terms of its journey towards having more renewable energy. Fossil fuels, particularly coal, make up a large percentage of Japan's energy mix. And so that's something we will expect to play out over the next few years. Importantly, it doesn't matter whether it continues to be Suga as prime minister or somebody else. We'd still expect those 2 things to be really important over the next few years. And so it really doesn't make any difference to how we think about investing. Those are powerful long-term drivers.
Okay, so more than half of Japanese firms have a net cash position. Does that mean we'll see generous dividends and companies making acquisitions? Or do you think it's because Japanese companies are cautious and want that cash protection in case of bad times?
Yeah, it's a terribly important area to think about. And we believe there's an incredibly big change going on here in Japan in terms of attitude. So in the past, Japanese companies would just hold a lot of cash out of an abundance of caution. Whereas now that is really shifting, and we see dividends increasing each year. We see share buybacks increasing here each year, and it's still an early stage, and we expect that to continue over really many years to come. I think that it is very notable that in the pandemic year, 2020, we saw a lot of dividends being paused or buybacks being halted in markets like the United Kingdom, whereas we didn't see that at all in Japan. And that's because Japanese companies have such very strong balance sheets, so they're able to weather the storm. But it also means that we will continue to see that progress in terms of shareholder return this year and for many years to come.
So what do you look for in a company when considering new investments for the JPMorgan Japanese portfolio?
Well, the first thing that we want to do is think about where will that industry and company be in 3 years' time, 5 years' time, 10 years' time. And then the second thing we want to do is look at the financials of that company. And ultimately, we want companies with high levels of profitability, very strong free cash flow, excellent balance sheets. And ideally, they should be number one at what they do, whether that be domestically or overseas. In Japan, when we're looking at companies, it's often disruptors, relatively newer companies who have a really big opportunity ahead of them. Overseas, we see global number one companies in areas like automation, robotics, in many parts of semiconductor production, and even in surprising areas. For example, the global number one online employment company, which is a company called Indeed, is owned by a Japanese company called Recruit. But wherever we look, we're looking for the really best-in-class companies, whichever area we're looking in.
Well, Nicholas, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.